everybody. Thanks for joining me for Conversations on Character, Community, and Crisis. This series is part of the Virtues and Vocations initiative here at Duke University, which seeks to make questions of purpose, meaning, and character central to higher education. My name is Suzanne Shanahan, and I direct the Kenan Institute for Ethics here at Duke, which is host for this initiative and the series. A super quick note on logistics. In this new Zoomified reality, there are often technical glitches. Please stay calm and be rest assured that we have many folks working behind the scenes who can swiftly jump in to address such technical issues. Second, we're going to have a conversation for about 40 minutes, at which time we'll transition to audience questions. You can submit those via the Q&A mechanism, and they'll be forwarded on to me directly to ask. So with that, I am really delighted to introduce Professor Andrew Delbanco on what is higher education for. Andy is the Alexander Hamilton Professor of American Studies at Columbia University, where he has taught since 1985. He is also president of the Teagle Foundation. In 2012, he was honored by President Barack Obama with the National Humanities Medal. Professor Delbanco's most recent book is the much celebrated The War Before the War, Fugitive Slaves and the Struggle for America's Soul from the Revolution to the Civil War. It was named a New York Times Critic Best Book Award of 2018, the 2019 Anisfield Wolf Book Award for Nonfiction. It was the winner of the 44th Annual Lionel Trilling Book Award, and it was also the 2019 Lucas Prize Award winner. Professor Delbanco is also author of Melville, His World and Work, as well as College, What It Was, Is, and Should Be. And with that, thank you so much for joining me, Andy.
Thank you, Suzanne. It's a pleasure to be here. And I'm sure all your other visitors have said something similar. I'm sorry we can't go meeting in person. But we hope in the future that'll be possible. I should also apologize. I'm looking a little slovenly. This is my sort of COVID beard and haircut situation. I don't remember to shave every day, but I mean no disrespect.
Excellent. I'm also going to note, I'm actually here in my Duke office where they're mowing the lawn right out front. So if you hear a lawnmower, that's what it is. In terms of today's conversation, I know we checked in on this earlier. I think what we want to do is have folks get a sense of your perspective on higher education, both through your work at the Teagle Foundation, but also in your 2012 book, College, What It Was, Is, and Should Be, and then transition a little bit to thinking about the impact of the past 6-7 months, both COVID-19 and the recent racial unrest, on how you're thinking about higher education at this moment. Sound like a plan?
Sounds like a plan. And if I start talking at too great length, please cut me off and let's go in a different direction. So, you know, I note that I think the title you've given to this session is What is Higher Education For? Mm-hmm. And I think it would be fair to say that there are a lot of respectable answers to that question, and different people would put the emphasis in different places. I mean, the reality is that higher education is for credentialing, which is not one of my favorite functions, but it's true. People, you know, people assume things about other people based on what degrees come after their name. It's about networking. It's about meeting peers that you can associate with for the rest of your life. It's about matchmaking. And it's about, I think most people would think first, it's about the acquisition of skills or marketable capabilities so that you're in a better position to be competitive in the increasingly competitive marketplace, which is, as we all know, is now a global marketplace. So, so I wrote this book almost a decade ago now, which really had the very simple purpose of suggesting, well, yeah, there's some merit to all of those propositions, but higher education is also about something else. It's about the development of citizens. Now, that word has become more charged since I used it in that book, because there are a lot of people in this country who have every right to be participating in our civic life who are not offered the opportunity to become citizens. So when I say citizen, I mean it in a broad sense of a person who participates in an informed and responsible way in a democratic society. It seems to me that every college and university ought to consider that responsibility among its highest. And then it's also, one hopes and believes, it's also for the purpose of self-fulfillment. It's for the purpose of enlarging the mind and even the heart through the experiences of college going, which, as we all know, the time in the classroom is actually a pretty small fraction of the time that students spend in college. It's about associating with peers, about getting to know people who are different from you, who have different experiences than yours. So to stimulate the empathetic imagination, to broaden the mind. It's about things that, they sound squishy, they're hard to measure. There are no metrics for these things as far as I can tell. But perhaps for that very reason, they are among the most important functions of higher education and functions on which our society heavily depends. I'll conclude this little rant by saying it came into my email this morning, a study, I think sponsored by Georgetown University, that showed that people with college degrees, even not just BAs, but AAs, are less inclined to be sympathetic to authoritarianism. Now that's complicated. People with college degrees also tend to be economically better off than people without college degrees, and that has a bearing on what you think about politics. But I would like to think that a liberal education, which is what I'm really talking about, immunizes people to some extent against the appeal of authoritarian demagoguery. And I won't make a political speech right now, but that's a real danger in the world today.
So do you think that students coming to a place like Columbia or Duke, or even a place like UNC down the road, understand that to be one of the things that happens at college, or one of the goals of college? To what extent do they understand this, as you've described the classroom as kind of a practice ground for democracy? And does it matter if they understand that's part of what happens here?
I think it does matter. And honestly, and I won't pick on any particular institution, I think all institutions could be doing a better job of communicating to prospective students and matriculated students that the institution takes these purposes seriously. Young people are very good at sniffing out hypocrisy, in my experience, and they're very good at telling who's talking the talk and who's walking the walk. And, in this hyper-competitive environment, which institutions occupy just as much as individuals, so much of what comes out from our colleges and universities is about prestige. It's about, we went up in the US News rankings, or on the athletic field where we've got the winning team, or we've got the most Nobel Prizes in the faculty, or we got the highest SAT scores among the students. And, if that's the dominant discourse, even in some cases, what are our graduates earning on average 5 years out of college? We do better than the school down the road. If that's the dominant discourse, it's sort of unreasonable to expect students to take seriously the sort of thing that I was just saying. So we can talk about that, but and it's quite understandable that institutions feel the need to compete with their rivals, particularly in this economic climate. But we could be doing a better job of articulating the principles that I suspect most of the participants in this kind of conversation agree about. I can't see our audience, and I don't know who's in our audience, but my guess is that there's a certain amount of preaching to the choir going on here, at least on the broad themes. Yep. There may be disagreement about what it really means to deliver education for citizenship or education for self-fulfillment, but probably most of the people at this meeting think that those are important goals.
So part of this, as you described it, is about getting universities to be explicit that this is in fact something they value, and it's one of the goals of a Columbia education, a Duke education, a UNC education. Are there things you think in particular structurally in terms of curriculum, orientation, programming more generally that universities need to be doing to reinforce those things? Or do you think sort of an articulation of this is what happens at Columbia, this is what happens at Duke is sufficient there? And sort of a second part of this is, where do the parents fit in, right? Sort of, I teach a lot of first-year students here at Duke, and oftentimes the parents are as anxious about the credentialing functions, the 5-year trajectory of earnings and things like that as the students might be. Are there, like how do you actually do that? As you said, we're all kind of preaching to the choir here a little bit in this community, but how do you instantiate that on campuses effectively?
Well, those are really easy questions to answer, right? So thanks we could talk about that question alone, at least for the rest of this hour. So let me try to say a couple things. First, any discussion of higher education runs the risk of relying on generalizations that are not very effective at capturing the diversity of institutions and the diversity of students. Mm-hmm. So when you speak of the parents, for example, it's totally understandable to me that if a child coming to college is the first in their family to go to college, what we now call first gens, mm-hmm. And there's a significant financial sacrifice being made by the parents' family or extended family or whatever it may be to make that possible for the student. It's totally reasonable to expect that that family is focused on what will the return be on their investment, right? Why go here, which costs X, when I could go to a public community college that costs a lot less, or not go at all and get a job right out of high school. So one has to take this seriously and not, have the attitude of the privileged, they shouldn't be thinking about financial issues at all. That's demeaning. That's not fair, and that's not my point. Now, the parents of from an affluent family who are coming to a place like Duke or Columbia, one would like to think that they would be a little less anxious about the payoff in dollar terms. But it doesn't feel to me like that's the case. And in fact, at the most elite institutions, you see students leaving the fields like the humanities, which have a less obvious connection to post-college economic success, and going into fields like business and computer science and the healthcare fields, which have an obvious or a very large number of students going into what we euphemistically call financial services, meaning they want to be an investment banker. And I don't mean to say that there aren't virtuous investment bankers, but it's always struck me as a little odd that if an 18 or 19-year-old's aspiration in life is to become wealthy by moving around other people's money. But that's just a personal throwaway comment, which I probably shouldn't have made. Anyway, so these are it's understandable for those students who face economic pressure, and it's not mysterious in our kind of society where success is so often measured by financial standing and social prestige and so on, that students and families are drawn in that direction. So these are hard forces to resist. Now, how should institutions resist them if they believe that there are other, dare I say, higher purposes to an undergraduate education? And here I have to say, I'm going to take you use the word curriculum in your question, and I'm going to take that as an opportunity to talk as if my Teagle Foundation hat is on now. And we can go back to the other issues as you wish. I really do think that curriculum makes a difference. And one of my and our strongest commitments at the Teagle Foundation, and I hope you'll be reading a bit about it in coming weeks, because we've just established a partnership with the National Endowment for the Humanities to make an intervention, as they say, in this area, is to ask institutions to rethink what they're doing in general education. General education, by which I mean broadly, that part of the student's time in college that's outside their specialty, outside their major. If you look at the last 75 years of American higher education history, general education has basically become either distribution requirements or nothing to speak of. I mean, you either have some institutions have a completely open curriculum where students can take whatever they want, and I understand the idea behind that, which is basically the idea of freedom and self-discovery. And most institutions have one form or another of distribution requirements. You know, if you're going to be in the biological sciences, we want you to take a course or two in the humanities and a course or two in the social sciences. End of story, you're an educated person. I think this has been a very bad development in American higher education. I have no idea, Frank. I haven't done my homework. I don't know what the Duke curriculum looks like these days.
So just a sidebar there, right, and sort of for disclosure reasons, I led a 5-year aborted kind of review of the curriculum that ended in 2017. Where it was to kind of reinvigorate the principles of a liberal arts education. And right, we went down in flames.
Yeah, well, I'm sorry to hear that, but it's not too surprising. And there are a lot of other institutions where the same story can be told. So, you know, we may be tilting at windmills with this initiative, but we're gonna give it a try. So let me get down a little bit more to particulars. There's a vestige of what general education used to mean at many institutions, and that's the freshman or first year reading assignment. Mm-hmm. I don't know if you have one at Duke, a lot of places do. Okay. Seems to be based on the idea that when the students all arrive from far and wide with all their different perspectives on life, if they read something together, if everybody reads something that's provocative and elevating and stimulating, they'll get to know each other better, and they'll have something to talk about other than the things that young people are going to want to talk about in their first days in college. I think that's a fine idea, but I think it's a sort of pathetic vestige, I guess is the word I used, of a more robust commitment to having students read at least some texts that they have in common. I know the arguments break out as soon as you start talking about what texts they should be, but some texts that they have in common, not just over the summer when they arrive and maybe they read it, maybe they didn't read it, but actually while they're on the campus in that first year, so that they will have issues to discuss that go beyond their personal ambitions or their personal concerns. Now, that doesn't mean that I imagine colleges are suddenly going to adopt a St. John's College great books curriculum where everybody reads a list of 15 certified classics. Even if that were possible, I wouldn't be in favor of it. But there is a middle way somewhere between the total chaos of courses that basically reflect the interests of the faculty. Faculty give classes in whatever they're interested in, and students take them or not, depending on what they hear about. Are they popular? There's a middle ground between that, which is kind of where we are now, and what would have been the prevailing norm in the middle of the 20th century, which was some fraction of the students' coursework should be devoted to their exposure to basic philosophical ideas that, like them or not, have been formative for our society. That is, for example, political ideas, like the debate between John Locke and Thomas Hobbes about whether representative government is better than authoritarian government, whether human beings are capable of governing themselves and devising a government structure. In our case right now, we have, as you know, executive, legislative, and judicial branches, and we're at a very dicey moment as to whether that checks and balances system is going to continue to work, or whether human beings are so incapable of governing themselves that you need a strong man to enforce law and order. That's a debate. Yeah, those are two old white guys who wrote those contending books. But I would argue that the debate that they're having is arguably even more important today for students of color, students who are more vulnerable than their more affluent mainstream peers. So these are books, these are the kind of books or the kind of ideas with which I think all students should be expected to grapple. By the same token, let me just go a little further with this. Every white student should read at least part of W.E.B. Du Bois's great book, The Souls of Black Folk, in order to begin the process of understanding what a profoundly different experience it is in our society to be Black than it is to be white. And I could go down a list of other books that I think students should be asked to read. The point is that this is our opportunity to get students to talk with each other across the usual dividing lines, gender lines, race lines, sexual preference lines, ideological lines, class lines. You're never going to be able to cross those lines completely in the imagination, because when you finished reading the book and you leave the classroom, you're still who you were before, though the whole point of education is that maybe you have a different perspective than you had when you arrived in the room. So I believe in some degree of a shared educational experience. Now, how can we make this happen? I'm going to give you very briefly a concrete example. I don't know, again, who's in the audience, but if we have any deans or provosts or trustees or donors or anybody else who likes the sound of this, I hope they'll become interested in the initiative. So we made a grant a few years ago, led by a historian at Purdue University named Melinda Zook, who's a distinguished historian of early modern Britain, women's experience in early modern Britain in particular. And she had been watching the enrollments in her history classes decline, enrollments in the humanities decline, and she'd been watching the morale of humanities faculty decline. So instead of lamenting and gnashing teeth and rending clothes and saying nobody understands us and they don't appreciate the finer things in life, which is what a lot of us do when we feel besieged, she decided to do something about it. So she wouldn't mind, I think, if I tell it in this cartoonish way. She basically went over to the English department. She said, "Hey, hi, you may have noticed you don't have any students." Right? I mean, that's a little bit of an exaggeration, but not much. The seminars were shrinking and the morale was in the basement. So why don't you consider coming over, not all of you, but part of your teaching time, coming over to general education where they have a writing and oral communication requirement. Most places have at least that much. Mm-hmm. And instead of our giving them some mind-numbing class on how to write topic sentences, let's have a 2-semester sequence, and they call it Transformative Texts, where students in classes of capped at 30 with a real faculty member will read challenging books, anything from Plato to James Baldwin and Dr. King, or even beyond, to contemporary poets and writers, and have an experience in which they can talk through these texts. The text will mediate a discussion of issues that matter to all young people, like, what are my responsibilities to other people? What's the difference between love and desire? What kind of fulfillment do I think I want in life before death takes me away, as it will all of us? Young people want to think about those issues, and it's more productive to think, and it's less frightening to think about them with the help of a text that raises those questions and challenges you, and in the context where you can talk openly and freely with your peers under the mentorship of a caring teacher. So they established a program, they call it the Cornerstone Program, started with a pilot 3 years ago. It's not a prescribed reading list like the old great books lists. There are 200 books or something like that on this list that the faculty agreed should be on the list. And then they say to the faculty, okay, pick half your books from this list, please. And the other half, you can choose anything that you're excited about, anything that got you excited about being a faculty member in the first place. 3 years later, they have more than 2,000 students enrolled in these courses. This contrasts with 3 years ago, when fewer than 10% of the entire Purdue student population had taken a single course in literature. And you've got faculty from English, history, political science, philosophy, religion, and the deans of the professional schools, the engineering school, the School of Technology, are cheering them on and saying, we really want this for our students. We want them to be able to think critically about received ideas. We want them to be able to express themselves verbally, and we're all for it. In fact, a couple of divisions outside the liberal arts have made it a requirement. And there's another dimension to the program that I can talk about if you like. But anyway, that's an example of a creative response to the crisis of the humanities and of liberal arts more broadly. And I'm sure there are problems with it. I'm sure there are faculty there who resent it and feel that they're being drawn out of their specialty and all that. I understand that. But this was a creative and very effective response. And we at the Teagle Foundation, with funding assistance from the NEH, are going to try to see whether we can seed similar programs at other institutions. So if you want to try it again at Duke and Duke becomes interested, let me know. Right.
So a couple of questions. I think that's a fabulous example. So, Bray, do you know from that Cornerstone program, has that led to different pathways for students, right? So I love this idea that you're engaging students in relatively common readings early on in their experience. Do those students now end up more often in her classes as a history major as well? Or is this a common foundation that they then build, kind of a more pre-professional orientation on top of?
Great question and a couple of answers. It's a bit early to tell whether this program will have a significant impact on, say, the number of history majors or the number of English majors. There's early evidence that those numbers are growing, modestly, but growing. But also, I would say, I'm not hung up on the question of how many majors there are in the humanistic fields. And I don't think, as a colleague of mine used to say to me, you can't resist the culture. I mean, up to a point, we all try to, but, there's no doubt that the excitement, the intellectual energy, and the economic power is in these emerging fields that didn't exist 20 and 30 years ago, like artificial intelligence and so on. and the exciting developments in the natural sciences. So that I'm not interested in fighting against the STEM fields. I think the STEM fields are great. And some of my favorite students, my wife who teaches the art humanities class at Columbia would emphatically agree. Some of my favorite students are engineering students. So I don't mean to say that's what you were saying, but I don't think we should necessarily measure the success of a program like Cornerstone by the numbers of majors. However, they do have, there's another part to this program, which is, and that they call it Cornerstone because you can get a certificate if you want. At the same time you get your degree, you can get a Cornerstone certificate if you go beyond this introductory 2-semester course and you pursue a pathway and you get a certain number of upper level course credits. Now, what they've done is and in this case, in the case of the introductory course, they invented a new course. But and a miracle that Melinda pulled off is that she got faculty to commit to it, and she got administrators to agree to it. She got the general education people to agree to give credit for it. So she worked a miracle. With the upper level courses, I think it's a less heavy lift because a lot of the courses already exist. And what they're saying now is, okay, pick an area which is connected to your professional interest, technology and society, health and science, law and conflict resolution. I think those are 3 of the areas. And there are designated courses that you can take that allow you to bring humanistic questions to bear in those areas. And in some cases, courses have been reinvented and they have guest lecturers, a course on technology that may have a philosopher come in and give some talks about what does it mean that we now live in a surveillance state where anybody can know what we're doing at any moment. So that is gathering steam, and more students are signing up to pursue the certificate, perhaps because it's another credential.
Right.
And that's fine, that's one motivation. Let me get another credential so I can distinguish myself from the engineer from Illinois Tech against whom I'm going to be competing for a job after college. But this is a success story. And what we're trying to do at Teagle is to identify success stories and then plant them elsewhere in the hope that they will grow.
So I actually really like that model in that you're creating this baseline educational experience that then students are actually taking into their other degrees. If it's in a STEM field or in engineering or anywhere else they might go, pre-health, for example. So I think that's a really, really interesting model. One question before we kind of pivot to the more contemporary moment is, how do you think about these sorts of innovations across kind of university settings and structures, in that, sort of a place like Duke or Columbia, or maybe even Purdue is better positioned financially, politically, to be able to do certain things than other places? And is that a concern of folks at Teagle? I know you do a wide range of work, so maybe you could address that kind of inequality institutionally.
Well, we have a very severe inequality problem among institutions, just as we have in our society generally. I mean, the newspaper, the amount of ink, of course, is by now an obsolete metaphor, but the attention paid to a small handful of very wealthy institutions with large endowments is grotesquely out of proportion to the reality for most students. We want to remind ourselves, 75% of American undergraduates attend public institutions. Something between a third and a half of American undergraduates attend community colleges. That's a moving target. It's hard to know quite what the percentage is. The inequality among institutions is a very serious problem, and it's not a healthy situation. When you get right down to it, there are 4 institutions, namely Harvard, Yale, Princeton, and Stanford, whose endowments dwarf the endowments of all others, including yours and mine. So we have a real severe, not just 1%, but 0.1 or 0.01% problem in higher education. That said, broadly speaking, I actually think it's the more elite and better endowed institutions that are the least likely to change in a positive direction of the sort that I've been describing. Because when you got lots of resources and the students are clamoring to get in, and you read about yourself in the paper all the time, it's hard to say, we're not doing this right. We should be rethinking what we're doing. That's what I think those institutions should be asking themselves, but they're not as much as they should be. We are funding programs that are quite similar in spirit to the Cornerstone program at community colleges. At Austin Community College in Texas, there's something called I think it's the Great Questions program. At Ostos Community College in the Bronx in New York, and now at several other community colleges in the City University system. We are helping a group of faculty who want to bring these kinds of readings into the required introductory writing class. And they are seeing similar success. It's never going to be for all the students. It's not a compulsory thing that everybody has to take this, but they are seeing growing student interest and growing faculty interest. And I am firmly convinced, based on my own visits to, by now, well over 100 institutions around the country of all kinds, that there are students of talent and curiosity and giftedness and determination at every kind of institution you can imagine. In some ways, more so at the less well-funded institutions than at the affluent institutions. Students at Ostos Community College are likely to be less sophisticated when they write their first papers than the students in the Columbia core curriculum are. But there's no evidence that they have less valuable insights or are less engaged in their education. In fact, if anything, it may be the other way around. So that's a long-winded way of saying I think that some version of the Cornerstone idea can work at all kinds of institutions.
Great. Let's pivot a little and talk about the current moment. And somewhere recently, you kind of alluded to this really values crisis that this moment has called forth. How are you thinking about education now? And is it any different than it was, early in the new year?
Well, that last part of your question is hard to answer because, of course, well, I guess you're doing some in-person teaching at Duke. At Columbia, it's all online now.
And what's that experience like for you? Are you teaching this semester?
This particular semester, I'm actually not, but I did teach in the spring semester, and I will be teaching again in January when I suspect it'll be the same as it is now. The experiment that everybody ran last spring was not a good experiment, and I mean, we had no choice, but in the sense that the students we were teaching by Zoom already knew each other, and they knew us. We'd been in the classroom with them for 6 weeks. So I found that it was a shock and it was alienating in some degree, but basically it worked pretty well. Better than I expected, because I'm pretty skeptical about online teaching in general. Still, when you say, has teaching changed since COVID? I can't really answer that. It's been 6 months. The Zoom experience is different. Are there different issues on students' minds? I'm sure there are. I know there are. There's a higher degree of what we might call existential anxiety about their families, about themselves, about their future, about the future of the nation. And responsible teachers I keep using the word humanities, but I mean that broadly in fields like literature, political science, religion, philosophy, and economics, which in my opinion should be taught from a humanistic perspective. have a responsibility to teach both, the material, which may be from the past, but teach it in such a way that it makes a connection to students' concerns in the present. That's what makes for a good book, and that's what makes for a good teacher. And to do it in a non-proselytizing way, to do it in a way that leaves the air open for plural points of view. So that's the challenge of teaching right now. And I think the stakes could not be higher, in my opinion, because what we're seeing in the public sphere, I fear, is the breakdown of anything resembling bipartisanship. I mean, this has been coming for a long time. One party or the other is going to win on November 3rd. One party or the other, and it seems pretty clear which one it's going to be, is going to win over this Supreme Court fight right now. That's not the way it used to be. I'm old enough, and I don't mean to go into golden ageism. There's a lot of things about today's society that are better than when I grew up in the 60s and 70s. Better for women, better, I think, even for African Americans, though there's a long way to go, as we've recently been reminded. But there was a degree of bipartisanship. I mean, that's what the filibuster rule in the Senate is all about, right? In order to confirm a lifetime justice to the United States Supreme Court, somebody who is going to have something to say about the most deeply personal questions in all of our lives, you got to have 60 votes. You got to have some members of the other party who agree that this is a person of probity and thoughtfulness and open-mindedness. That's out the window. And that doesn't mean that a good judge might accidentally be appointed, but it does mean that we have virtually given up on talking, as they say, across the aisle. Now, in a college classroom, it must remain possible to speak across the aisle. It may be that most college students and most faculty are on one side of the political divide, but not all of them. And one has to be able to raise uncomfortable questions about most basic topics and to have a civil discussion about them without attacking the personal virtue of the person who's disagreeing with you. And I think that is possible in the college classroom. There are certain books that make it more possible than others, and certain teachers who make it more possible than others. That, to me, is the critical responsibility of teachers in this environment, because we must produce a generation of future leaders who are going to do better than the ones we've got right now. Let me give you one real quick concrete example. On the environment, which is something very much on the minds of young people, as it should be, it seems pretty clear that to ignore all the science and to claim that we're not experiencing climate change and that human behavior, namely the use of fossil fuels on such an enormous scale, that human behavior doesn't have something to do with this change. To make that claim is to confess ignorance, is to just be, and we've seen so much anti-science and I don't believe what the doctors are saying kind of nonsense. That's not really an acceptable position in a college classroom where the evidence is overwhelmingly on one side. However, once we reach agreement that yes, there is climate change, and yes, human behavior is contributing to it, the next question is, what should we do about it? And that is a much more complex question. And reasonable people can agree to disagree about it. Should governments be intervening very aggressively and imposing penalties and taxes and even criminal penalties if people behave in X way or Y way? Or should we let the marketplace do the work and recognize that that electric cars are going to become profitable and solar panels are going to become the way out of this? This is a very nuanced discussion. Should we immediately ban the use of fossil fuels? Well, if we did that, we would see social and economic upheaval that's hard to imagine. And so you got to find some kind of way to develop a path out of this crisis. And the only way we're going to do that is if people can actually exchange arguments, assess the evidence, weigh the pros and cons, and come to a civilized point of consensus. That's not happening in our politics. It's not happening in the press. I mean, you got the press on the left and the press on the right, and a few people who try to balance in between and not doing a great job. So colleges, I mean, you know, we're not going to solve these problems in the short term, because it takes a while for college students to grow up and become the people who have a big impact. Well, they can have a big impact as young voters and as participants in the political process. But colleges have a huge responsibility to make this kind of civil discourse around urgent questions possible. So and I think we probably agree about that. And the hard question, it's like the analogy to the environment example I gave. The question is, how does a college make that happen?
Right.
And there are different ways to make it happen, but I've given you a couple of examples of ways in which we think it can happen.
Do you think that kind of post-COVID, right, certainly universities are struggling with this new reality. Much of it is financial struggling. You have written about kind of the growing inequality in this moment between heavily resourced and under-resourced institutions. Do you think it will be harder to have these kinds of conversations on universities when the universities themselves are feeling financially pinched?
Yeah.
Right? Do you see this as a greater threat to the humanities than prior?
Well, I fear that that's likely because, as you say, every institution, even the wealthiest, is feeling some financial pain right now. In some cases, devastating pain that may even be, I hate to say it, in some cases may even be fatal to the future of the institution. And we'd need another hour to talk about why that is and why this is happening. So the immediate impulse is going to be budget savings. And you know what? There's basically only two the two big ticket items in any budget are the instructional budget, and colleges, not so much places like Duke and Columbia, but a lot of others have been managing the instructional budget by depending more and more on low paid contingent faculty labor. And the second big ticket item is financial aid. So there will be pressure to admit more students who can pay the full sticker price, and to cut back on the subsidies or discounting or financial aid or whatever term we prefer that have enabled students from less affluent backgrounds to attend institutions like Duke and Columbia. And I'm very worried about that. And I wish there were more transparency about it within institutions and that faculty were better informed about it, which is a shared responsibility of administration and faculty. So I fear it's likely we're going to see cutbacks in the softer fields where students are not present in large numbers, and we're going to see cutbacks in financial aid. The reason that we shouldn't see either of those is that, in my opinion, institutions that have some resources have a public obligation to make themselves accessible to students from less affluent families. And if they don't do that, they will only be contributing to the inequity problem that we have in our society and the declining sense of the possibility of social mobility and equal opportunity. And the reason that we shouldn't abandon the softer fields like the humanities and the soft social sciences is because the crisis that we're facing right now is not, and this is the remark you're alluding to, is not just a health crisis or an economic crisis, though it is certainly both of those. It's also a values crisis. I mean, take the mask question. I mean, there's an example where, and I wish the Vice President Biden would say something like this, but maybe his political advisors know better than I do. That the mask question is an issue on which religion and science should perfectly agree. Because the main function of a mask, we've learned from the scientists, is somewhat helpful in protecting the mask wearer. So yeah, I get, on a libertarian basis, a person could say, I can make my own decision about how much risk I want to take in contracting the virus. Nobody can tell me to wear a mask. Problem with that argument is that the main function of the mask is to protect other people. Because we know that asymptomatic people can generate the virus and infect others. And we know that wearing a mask can reduce that risk of transmission. So religion says, do unto others as you would have them do unto you. And science says, wear the mask so you can protect other people and thereby reduce the pandemic and help everybody and bring back the economy sooner rather than later. So this should be a no-brainer. This should be an open and shut. You could be an evangelical and you believe you should wear a mask, and you can be an atheistical, hyper-rational person and believe that you should wear a mask. But the public discourse isn't addressing it that way. Students should be thinking about it that way. And it's in the classroom that maybe those kinds of discussions can be stimulated.
Great. Okay, so a couple of questions teeing up. So, from Wendy Fishman and Howard Gardner at the Harvard Graduate School of Education.
Oh my goodness.
Wendy is curious about your thoughts on the following tension. In today's world, when so many college students come in and are more focused on themselves, their own ambitions, mental health issues, their own friendships and belonging issues, how can we get students to practice citizenship, take responsibility to the campus community when they see a problem, act when there's an issue?
Well, hi, Howard and Wendy. I don't know that there's a soundbite-sized answer to that complex question, and I don't mean to make the curriculum the be-all and the end-all, or to be repetitious more than I already have been. But a well-run classroom with a teacher at the front who thinks about the issues of the sort that you raise in your question, issues of responsibility and thinking beyond the self and citizenship, broadly speaking, with a text in the room that opens up those issues, that's a good place to start. I mean, of course, a college is a complex organism. There's also student organizations and athletic events and the relationship to alumni and campus traditions and all kinds of things that don't have much to do with what goes on inside the classroom. But I'm a teacher and a reader of old texts by and large. So I think those of us who are teachers and work in that arena within the institution can make a significant contribution to what you're talking about. And I actually, a lot of what I say is very critical about institutions and about where we are right now. I have a lot of, this is a cliche, but it's true. I have a lot of faith in young people. They do have the anxiety and the mental health concerns that you allude to. They're confused about why they're in college. Their parents are telling them what they should want from college. All of that is true. but they are still open to new experiences. And if you hit them with a question that goes to the heart of their own concern, they will pay attention. So I think that the classroom can be a transformative place, and the institution can be a transformative place if faculty collaborate on this kind of work and think of themselves a little bit less as specialized researchers and a little bit more as pastors or mentors to young people.
Great. Next question. Oh, and this is from a dear colleague, David Malone, in the program in education here at Duke, who is one of my partners in crime on the curriculum reform. And he asks, is this a moment or a movement? Is higher education simply adjusting to new circumstances, or are we at the beginning of a new paradigm shift in terms of what higher education is for? Is this a movement? Who and what are the resistors, obstacles within higher education and outside higher education? And how do we best move forward given our own experience of the emotional and territorial resistance of Duke's proposed new curriculum?
There's a lot of dimensions to that question. I see we got like 3 minutes left. So you use the word territorial in your question. I mean, I think there's the old cliche of turning a crisis into an opportunity. I think in the humanities, there is that opportunity to move from crisis to opportunity, because if humanities faculty do not commit themselves to something like this general education engagement that I've been talking about, there will be no humanities faculty to speak of in the future. They need to recognize that this is their calling. They can be researchers and writers of books as well, and trainers of graduate students. But if they don't engage with incoming undergraduate students, when the students are willing to be engaged, they have no future. Now, a tenured faculty member may not care too much because beyond his or her own tenure, but that department is going to shrink and shrivel and maybe even go away if they don't get engaged in general education. So that's one ground on which I think we can make the appeal. Is this a movement or a moment? Is there a paradigm shift coming? I mean, there's all kinds of, every week there are 3 or 4 Zoom seminars about the future of higher education and what the financial impact of the pandemic is going to be. And as you know, there have been some people predicting for years that the brick university is going to be replaced by the click university, and so on and so forth. The truth is, who knows? I mean, I'm really impressed. I have respect for my colleagues in the economics department. You may have seen an article the other day. Virtually every economist predicted that when the insurance mandate was taken away by the Republican Congress, Obamacare would collapse. It didn't. Because people, if there's a little subsidy for the insurance, and if it covers pre-existing conditions, and with the expansion of Medicaid, turned out that the insurance mandate penalty was no big deal. So with all due respect to my economist friends, those people who are predicting the implosion of higher education as a result of this pandemic, they may be right, they may be wrong, they may be half right and half wrong. Who knows? We will start to find out 6 months, 9 months or so from now, when the vaccines start to emerge. They won't be a panacea, but they will make things better, and we'll see. One thing I do know for sure, if the states and the federal government don't make a significant new commitment to investing in public higher education, we are really in trouble. And so on my more optimistic moments, and here I make a political comment, I'm hopeful that what we're witnessing is the last gasp of supply side economics and cultural reactionary politics, and that we may be moving into an era that might be described by the future historians as a new Deal, and that public support for institutions of higher education may increase in the future. But who knows? It'll be a few years before we know whether we're going backwards or forwards.
Great. Well, with that optimistic moment, I'm going to call the conversation at 1:01 And thank you so very much for joining us. This was great.
It's a pleasure. And again, I'm sorry I didn't see anybody in the audience, but I appreciate your sticking with it. And thank you for the invitation, Suzanne. And I hope life in Durham continues to be safe and productive for everybody.
Thank you so much.
Okay, thank you. Bye-bye.